In the period between 1982 and 2016, Canadian families experienced rapid technological and social change. In this time period, the Canadian identity became stronger with rights, freedoms, and multiculturalism becoming the hallmarks of what it means to be Canadian. On April 17, 1982, the Constitution Act came into force, which patriated the Canadian Constitution from Britain. Central to the Constitution is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As you can tell by the name, this is a charter that includes multiple rights and freedoms that are thought to be required in a free and democratic society. It is made up of fundamental freedoms, democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, and equality rights. This charter also recognizes the various cultures and backgrounds of Canadian families, ensuring citizens freedom of religion, association, assembly, and expression. A few years later, in 1988, the Canadian Multiculturalism Act was passed, which further entrenched Canada's identity as a multicultural nation. The multiculturalism policy allows citizens to practice their religions and keep their identities without the fear of persecution. The policy emphasizes a mutual respect between ethnicities and also acceptance of one's personal beliefs. Canada is a nation built on immigrants. In the 1980s, the focus of the government's immigration policy was family reunification and humanitarian concerns. But that focus changed in 2001 with the passing of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. This new policy emphasized education, language skills, and adaptability. This point system rewards applicants who are eager and have desirable degrees and skills. 46% of all successful immigration applicants enter through the Federal Skilled Workers Program. Unlike earlier in the century when immigrants primarily came from the United Kingdom and Europe, by 2006 immigrants from Asia and the Middle East were more prevalent in Canada. Canada has become one of the top 3 refugee resettlement countries in the world. In 1994, 34.4% of refugees came from Europe, but by 2009 that number had decreased to only 8.3%. The top 5 source countries for refugees resettled in Canada in 2006 were Afghanistan, Colombia, Ethiopia, Burma, and Sudan. In 2009, 13% of refugees originated in the Asia-Pacific region, and another 13% in Central and South America. In 2015, the newly elected Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged to accept 25,000 refugees from war-torn Syria, and those refugees are now building a new life here. The vast majority of immigrants eventually choose to become Canadian citizens and make a life in Canada for their families. In 2011, Canada was home to around 6,775,800 immigrants, representing 20.6% of Canada's population. The definition of the Canadian family has evolved. In 1981, 55% of all families consisted of legally married couples with children. By the 2006 census, there were 8,651,335 families in Canada, but less than 35% of those families consisted of 2 married parents and their children. 25% of all Canadian families with children were a single-parent situation. Blended families with step-parents and siblings, as well as families with 2 unmarried parents, were also significant. The Civil Marriage Act in 2005 made it legal for same-sex couples to get married, giving rise to yet another category of family structure. The prevalence of dual-income households was another significant development in the time period. The role of mothers in particular changed. Women pursued higher education and meaningful careers. Children were sent to daycare or had a nanny. Women started their families later in life, and families were smaller. When parents were able to be at home, they were exhausted or needed to do the house chores. This was despite the fact that many inventions were present in family homes that Canadians did not have access to 100 years ago, which were meant to ultimately make life easier. Technological advancement has been huge over the past couple years. Computers began to enter Canadian homes throughout the 80s in many different models. These were large boxes opposed to the slimmer models that we saw later in the time period. The internet was not available on these computers until the mid-1990s. Laptops were around all through the 80s but did not gain popularity until the 1990s. Now laptops are more common than desktop computers. Cell phone service became available to Canadians on July 1st, 1985. These phones looked like portable home phones. They were huge and definitely could not fit in your pocket. These phones gradually became smaller and smaller and then turned into flip phones in the 90s. Smartphones began to sell in Canada around 2010 and have been the go-to mobile device ever since. Young children even have phones and tablets and can navigate the programs and apps with ease. In 1982, CDs became the prime devices to play and record music on. In 1997, the DVD came out and had an even greater storage format than the similar-looking CD. In 2003, Apple introduced the iTunes stores, allowing Mac users to download single songs or a whole album at a fixed price. Today, more than 7 million songs are downloaded each day worldwide. Technological advancements have also come in other forms. Genetically modified organisms alter the DNA of some crops to make them more naturally resistant to pests or to enhance their vitamin content. Stem cell technology promises new treatments for disease. More and more electric and hybrid cars are hitting Canadian roads, decreasing our dependency on fossil fuels. Those are just a few things that technology has done for Canadians. As there are advancements in technology, children suffer due to their parents' more cautious outlook on life. Abductions, shootings, and similar tragedies have always occurred. However, increased access to news and social media have made parents more aware of the perceived dangers that may confront their children. Now that families hear frequently of all the terrible things happening in their own country, they are less willing to allow their children to do things such as go to the park by themselves and walk around town without parental supervision. The millennium of 2000 was very exciting to many families. There were celebrations all across Canada and even the world. However, some were actually very scared of the problems that could happen with the new year. More specifically, they were afraid of the millennium bug. Their fear came from the idea that computers would be unable to read the date 2000 and assume that they meant 19,000 instead. Known as Y2K, it was believed that this would cause problems with banks, meaning it would give families financial issues. They stocked up on food and necessities just in case, but there were no problems. Styles in the 1980s were adventurous and odd. Neon, bright accessories, dull clothing colors, high waistlines, and dressing preppy were all very common. Hair was typically teased and makeup was heavy. This style appealed mostly to young family members, but older people still loved to style themselves in these statement outfits. The 90s had a variety of styles. For some it was loose-fitting, colorful clothes and like turtlenecks. For others it was more of a grunge look with flannels and ripped jeans. Mullets were common hairstyles for men at the time as well. The 1980s was a great time for music. Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper, and Bon Jovi all made their way onto family rodeos with their hit songs. The Cosby Show and Family Ties were hit television shows. Many of the shows shown on the television mimicked family life at home. Movies such as The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Ghostbusters were popular movies. Madonna is an iconic 80s singer. She affected teenagers in Canada with her scandalous music such as her hit Like a Virgin and clothing choices. As others were dressing preppy, Madonna was wearing barely anything. This was odd in the 80s, but has become normal in the modern day. Parents did not want their children to idolize the singer in any way. Musical greats of the 90s were Green Day and Mariah Carey. The Backstreet Boys and other heartthrob boy bands were also extremely popular among teenage daughters. Boy Meets World and Full House were common shows for families to enjoy together. The 90s had many huge movies, but Titanic, Jurassic Park, and Fight Club stand out as being popular. So far in the millennium of 2000, various family members enjoy artists such as Lady Gaga, Justin Bieber, One Direction, Taylor Swift, and many, many more. Popular movies have been Harry Potter, Avatar, and Jurassic World. Superhero movies have also become a favorite for families to enjoy. There are many television shows for all ages. Reality TV shows such as Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Dancing with the Stars, and cooking game shows have become many families' guilty pleasure. These programs have influenced many people in Canada, making them aspire to be like the sometimes horrible people that they view on the television. Recently, TV shows and movies have moved onto the online program Netflix. This means that families with a subscription can now view whatever they want on their personal laptops and smartphones. Theme parks have gained popularity as a great place for families to go ever since the early 80s. In the 80s, children enjoyed playing with the Cabbage Patch Kid dolls, Light Brights, action figures, and bicycles. As for the 90s, children typically wished for Skippets, Pogs, and Beanie Babies. With the new technology, children began to play outside less. Now they want to play video games, watch the television, or go on their tablet. Several natural disasters affected Canadian families in the time period, including tornadoes, floods, fires, blizzards, and ice storms. On May 1st, 1985, there was a tornado outbreak in the United States and Canada. A total of 44 tornadoes touched down on that day. The part of the tragedy that hit Canada is referred to as the Barrie Tornado. This tornado was devastating to Canadian families. 12 people were killed, 281 were injured, and almost 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, leaving many homeless and unemployed. In 1997, the Red River Flood altered the lives of many. This was the largest flood to hit Manitoba since 1826. About 28,000 people needed to be evacuated, and thousands of farms, homes, and businesses were destroyed by the rising water levels. Many troops and volunteers provided assistance to the affected by digging ditches and piling sandbags in order to prevent the water from going any further. In 1998, an ice storm hit parts of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. In some areas, the storm lasted for a week and resulted in the temporary displacement of 600,000 people. Massive power outages and closed roads affected many families in the region. 35 people were killed and 945 were injured. A wildfire began near Fort McMurray, Alberta on May 1st, 2016. By May 3rd, the fire was spreading through the community. The families in the area were evacuated to a safer location while their town was being ruined. It is continuing to spread across Alberta and into Saskatchewan. As of right now, there have been approximately 2,400 buildings and family homes destroyed. Economically, the period between 1982 and 2016 was tumultuous with many highs and lows. The Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the United States came into effect in 1987 and eliminated trade restrictions on certain goods and services between the countries. The North America Free Trade Agreement came into effect on January 1st, 1994, and includes Canada, USA, and Mexico. By the end of 2014, trade between the nations reached $1 trillion. Canada experienced an economic recession in both 1982 and 1990. In these periods, the demand for consumer goods declines and families put off big purchases. This results in lower production employment. Unemployment rates in Canada reached a high of 11.9% in January of 1984. This was its highest since 1936. This led to families being unable to afford necessities and some becoming homeless. Luckily, homelessness also gained recognition in the 80s with donations and charities aimed at them specifically. Real estate prices are gradually rising in this time period. With a large amount of immigrants in the 80s, Vancouver raised their prices immensely, making it difficult for some to live there. Toronto and Vancouver are currently experiencing a housing boom, with the average price for a home in Toronto topping $1 million. The United States saw their largest stock market crash since the Great Depression from 2007 to 2008. Canadian families were affected since the USA is our biggest market for export. This meant that there was a vast decrease in global trade and financial markets became weaker. The Goods and Service Tax, or GST, was introduced in 1991. Most provinces already collected a provincial sales tax, so this federal levy was an additional cost on most consumer goods and services. Canadians were affected by violence and acts of terrorism in the period between 1982 and 2016. On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182 blew up mid-flight between Montreal and London, England. A total of 329 people were killed, including 268 Canadian citizens. The bombing was suspected to be the work of Sikh terrorists living in Canada. On December 6, 1989, a man by the name of Narc Lépine walked into an engineering class at l'École Polytechnique in Montreal. He carried with him a gun and a list of 19 feminists that he wished to kill. After separating the men in the class from the women and declaring his major hatred for all feminists, he sadly murdered 14 of the people on his list and then proceeded to shoot himself as well. September 11, 2001 is a date that is remembered as a tragedy to everyone around the world. On this date, working parents in America said goodbye to their children as they always did before they left to work at the World Trade Center located in New York City. While they were working, a hijacked plane crashed into the North Tower, causing it to collapse. About 20 minutes following, another plane crashed into the South Tower. Soon after, a third plane crashed into the Pentagon. There was a fourth plane, however, the passengers fought the hijackers of that one, causing it to crash in Pennsylvania, opposed to the original target. These attacks were conducted by an Islamic terrorist group. 2,996 people were killed, including 2,606 people from the World Trade Center. Everyone on the hijacked planes, 125 at the Pentagon, 343 firefighters, and many others there to help the situation. More than 6,000 others were injured. The attacks claimed the lives of 26 Canadian citizens, but had an impact on every Canadian. On October 22, 2014, a lone gunman, Michael Zayoff Bevu, shot and killed Corporal Nathan Surlo, a Canadian soldier holding ceremonial guard over the tomb of the unknown soldier in Ottawa. After this attack, Bevu entered the Parliament buildings, threatening the Prime Minister and the sitting government for being shot down. Bevu is believed to have been influenced by the terrorist organization ISIS. Thanks to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for the first time in the history of Canada, the Aboriginal peoples have received proper recognition and the rights have been assured. Aboriginals are still working towards a better life in Canada. They are managing to have a self-government, becoming friendly with the other Canadian neighbors, developing economically, and receiving recognition for the ways that their people were wrongly treated in the past. Despite these positive steps, conflicts still do arise. Land claims, protests in Oka, Quebec, Ipperwash, Ontario, and Caledonia, Ontario, have led to uncomfortable and sometimes deadly confrontations between First Nation protesters and the police. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed to look into the circumstances surrounding the residential schools in which First Nation children were separated from their families and forced into boarding schools. On June 11, 2008, Prime Minister Harper formally apologized to First Nations communities for the residential school system on behalf of all Canadians. Japanese Canadians also got an apology from the Canadian government. In September 1988, the Government of Canada apologized for the wrongful incarceration, seizure of property, and the disenfranchisement of Japanese Canadians during World War II. In 1995, there was another referendum concerning the nationalism of Quebec. It was another attempt for the province and its people to leave Canada and become their own country. The result was very close, as the side that was against the idea received 50.58% of all the vote, meaning they won by only 0.58% in total. This was good for the remainder of Canada, since despite the fact that Quebec wished to leave, the other Canadians, for the most part, wished for them to stay, as they were a major part of Canada's identity. On April 1st, 1999, the Northwest Territories divided and the East Side became a new territory named Nunavut. The world had been living in fear of the Soviet Union and the Cold War for decades. Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet Union's leader in the 80s. He was considered less insane than the country's previous leaders. He was willing to allow more freedom and independence as well as more Western ideas into the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed, thus ending the Cold War. Canadian troops were involved in many conflicts over the period, including the Persian Gulf War, the Bosnian War, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and the intervention against the Islamic State of Iraq. Remaining a middle power, the Canadian military used to step step towards only to be peacekeepers. However, due to the vast changes in our world, things have changed. Following 9/11, Canada began to move away from the idea of being a peacekeeping nation and began to take on a combat roles in locations such as Afghanistan. The Olympic Winter Games of 1988 were held in Calgary, Alberta. Families went to cheer on their nation's athletes at the various events. Later in 2010, Canada hosted another Olympic Winter Games in Vancouver, British Columbia. Canadians were proud to show off their beautiful country. Canada is a country of multiculturalism, beautiful landscapes, talented, smart, and polite citizens, strong economic systems, and viable social programs. Although it's not perfect, it is the best country in the world for families to live, work, play, and thrive.